Don't be afraid, you can come toward the front. Welcome to everybody. Welcome to the delegation of the European Union to the United States. We're really delighted to host this event today on the future of Syria and how to prevent the Syrian conflict from becoming a forgotten war. This event launches our exhibition that you can see on the wall on Faces of Resilience from Syria and the Region, which shows some of the beneficiaries of the European Union's Trust Fund in response to the Syrian crisis. And this event actually launches as well our campaign on the EU's participation to the spring meetings of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. We have a great lineup of speakers tonight. Ambassador Stavros Lambrinidis, the ambassador of the European Union to the United States, will open this event. And we then have a panel led by Kevin Barron from Defense One, with Mona Yacoubian from the United States Institute of Peace, and Jennifer Cafarella from the Institute for the Study of War. Unfortunately, our speaker from the State Department had to cancel because of a flu epidemics apparently in his office. But we saw as well in the registration list that we have many people here in the room who are experts, and actually some of you are from Syria, and we obviously want to hear from you. So we will make sure as well to open the discussion to you tonight. Just a number of housekeeping rules. So this event is on the record and actually live streamed, as you can see in the back with the camera. And we actually thank you. We thank all of those who are watching us live. And we would like to encourage you to engage on social media using the hashtags EU at Spring Meetings and EUTF Syria. You can see them on the side. We'll try to make sure to lower the temperature too, because I realize it's very warm in here and many of you are suffering. So with that being said, I would like to welcome Stavros Lambrinidis, the ambassador of the European Union to the United States, to open the event. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin, very much, and thank you to all for choosing to be here tonight. In the midst of a marathon, indeed, of meetings and events in the context of the spring meetings. And that means a lot to us. It means a lot to me personally. This is my first speaking engagement as the officially ambassador of the European Union. I handed my credentials yesterday to the President of the United States. Although I have been running non-stop since March 4th when I landed in this country. And I'm especially proud that this is the first official speaking engagement because of my previous life and my previous hat as well, running the European Union's human rights foreign policy, and the remarkable emphasis that I placed then and Federica Mogherini and everyone placed in the European Union on the conflict in Syria, on the refugee crisis. Now, this event tonight is the opening of our exhibition shedding light on Syrian women and men, girls and boys, who had to flee their homes to look for protection. All of those depicted here have benefited from the support of the European Union, which has sought to make the living conditions more bearable. They will never be bearable, more bearable. We are sometimes inclined to turn a blind eye to the suffering of the Syrian people. That's a fact. There's a risk of fatigue setting in with regard to a conflict which has now been going on for over 8 years. We are tempted to look for the comfort of indifference sometimes. We sometimes become accustomed to images of destruction and massive displacements of civilians. We sometimes even look at those pictures and those people with fear. What a shame, but how true sometimes. We should never, ever allow that to happen. We should never look elsewhere. We should never become immune to the pain and suffering caused by the conflict in Syria. And as rightfully proud as we are as Europeans for the work and support and unwavering commitment that they have shown to date, we should never think that our engagement is good enough, strong enough, as long as this conflict continues. Now, we recently celebrated the capture of the last piece of territory held by Daesh in Syria, And I want to pay tribute to the Syrian Democratic Forces who played a decisive role at great human cost, as well as thank the Global Coalition Against ISIS for its crucial campaign. And as you know, the European Union is a very proud member of that coalition. Although we obviously do not carry airstrikes and combat operations ourselves, more about this later, I want to recognize the key contribution of the United States and of our member countries which have played a major role in that military campaign. Now, the defeat of the so-called ISIS caliphate should, however, not lead us to become even more indifferent to the conflict in Syria. At the third European Union United States Syria conference that took place in Brussels last month, the EU's High Representative for Foreign and Security Policy, Federica Mogherini, warned about the risk of Syrian conflict becoming a forgotten war. The violence in Syria must stop, and the EU will continue to play its part fully and to mobilize all political, humanitarian, early recovery and resilience tools at its disposal. Now, dear friends, many of you hear numbers, figures, donations, and sometimes in a city like this, it doesn't mean much. There's one more figure thrown out. But think about how many hundreds of thousands of lives are actually being on the ground, helped, saved every day, but by the money that is necessary to provide that saving, to provide that food, to provide that medicine, to provide that education. We remain the main donors in Syria, the European Union, with almost 11 billion mobilized collectively with our member states in humanitarian, economic, stabilization assistance. And this was reconfirmed at the Brussels conference, where the European Union and the United Nations mobilized renewed international support, a record overall. We will continue supporting actions on the ground that improve the living conditions of Syrian refugees and the local communities, including through the European Union's Trust Fund in response to the Syrian crisis, which has funded the actions that are currently on display on our walls and which appear on your screen if you watch live. We will keep supporting resilience, early recovery, livelihood support, including through programs that enable Syrian refugees to get access to clean water, to healthcare, to education. Demining, you saw a photo out there on someone doing demining. Demining programs are key. Programs that bring some normalcy in the life of displaced and injured people are key. We will also keep supporting the UN-led political process, which is the only viable one to promote accountability, justice, and social cohesion in Syria. Dear friends, Syria is a tragic example of how the nature of security threats and the way to address and build security has changed dramatically in recent years. Look at Syria, look at Libya, look at the Ukraine. Solving those crises might require a traditional security component, but most of all, it requires diplomacy. It requires mediation. It requires the economic capacity to engage in the reconstruction and to transform a war economy and a war society into a peace economy and to a peace society. You can make sure that all the bad guys with all the bad guns are gone. You still don't have a country for people to return to and to live in peace and prosperity and harmony. You need to be ready to rebuild institutions. How boring does that sound? To a press that wants the sound bite. Try to get a country working without a judiciary that works, without a police that respects human rights. Go ahead, try to do it. And tell me if you succeed. You won't. And in 6 months' time, you have another war breaking out. You have to give humanitarian aid, and you have to give private investment a chance to take hold in addition to the development aid that you give. I'm deeply proud as a European for that development aid and that humanitarian aid. Europe is about 8% of the world's population, about 20% of the world's economy, and it is more than 57% of the world's development aid. Only 8% of the population and 20% of the economy accounts for 57% of the money that builds schools and hospitals and supports girls' education and boys' education and changed lives. I am proud. But I know that very often it's not enough. The conditions are tough because the security situation has changed. The military approach, as important and inevitable as it often is simply not enough. We need a creative mix of tools to be able to address different countries and different situations. Today, the money invested in humanitarian aid, in sustainable development, in climate action, in protection and promotion of human rights, and even sometimes the money mobilized in trade agreements, that is also an investment in security and peace in the world. I call this sustainable security. Many times people talk about security and they think that guns will do it alone. They won't. When it comes to development, those of you following the United Nations will know that we don't talk about development anymore. We talk about sustainable development. We have the sustainable development goals, not the development goals, because the international community at some point came to the realization that you can indeed develop. If you ruin your environment, you'll produce cheap goods. If you have slave labor and child labor, you'll produce cheap goods. But that is a development that will shred apart the social fabric of your society. It's not sustainable. And in the exact same way, we have to begin placing the word sustainable before the word security. Sustainable security. It is difficult, hard work. It doesn't have quick wins, but it is what the people on the ground require of us. They want us to be serious about this. Let me close with an example that, quite frankly, I saw myself. I talked about myself as the European Union Special Representative for Human Rights. We fought Daesh, terrorists. We eliminated the caliphate. We still have to continue fighting the terrorism. And it's not just in Syria. And many times when the European Union went around the world and said, you know what? You need to fight terrorists while protecting human rights. Don't torture people. Don't kill people. Don't kill people's rights to speak, to disagree sometimes with the government. We were told that these are luxuries in today's world. When you have to bring security to fight terrorists, human rights is a luxury. And they would ask me, Ms. Lambrinidis, don't you agree? Isn't it a luxury? Be serious. And I would answer that question with another question. I would ask them, okay, can you please tell me what is so scary then about smart girls? Why did Boko Haram in Nigeria abduct a few hundred girls from school instead of bombing one more army barracks they're good at? Why did the Taliban in Pakistan plant a bullet in Malala Yousafzai's head? Why did in Iraq, indeed, ISIS abduct and rape and forcefully marry hundreds of Yazidi girls? What is so scary about smart girls to terrorists? And the answer is, to us at least, that smart girls tend to become educated girls. Educated girls tend to become empowered women. And empowered women, they change entirely the balance of power in any society. And the last thing that a terrorist wants is an empowered society. They want societies that have big black holes of power that they can fill in with their hatred and with their violence. So you want to fight terrorists? Educate girls and boys. And of course, use military means where necessary. But understand, as the European Union does, when it becomes increasingly a security provider around the world, that it is a holistic approach to security, sustainable security, that makes the difference in the end. Dear friends, tonight we have the privilege to welcome several speakers who act every day to improve the lives of civilians in Syria and the region. peoples who make sure that the conflict in Syria does not become a forgotten war. I want to thank them for the leading role, and I know that many of you who attend this event or watch the webcast also take action in one way or another. Thank you. So, let me invite one of the top reporters covering Syria, Kevin Barron from Defense One, to lead tonight's discussion. I hope you enjoy it. I will not be able to stay for long. It is part of becoming the official ambassador now. The obligations never end, but I will stay as much and as long as I can to listen to the discussion. So thank you very much.
So I will now invite the speakers to come in front, and I shamefully forgot to mention, of course, Michael Köhler, who is a director for the neighborhood south at the European Commission. So the man behind the action of the European Union in Syria and the neighborhood, and he's with us tonight, and he's going to join us as well in front. So the mic is yours now, Kevin.
Thank you, Martin. Please come on up. Take your speaker spots.
Any protocol? Or
There's no protocol. This is the European Union.
If you knew what you were saying.
Clearly. Mr. Ambassador, thank you for that very impassioned speech. I'm going to try out this stool I've been given to lead us into this discussion. My name is Kevin Barron. I'm the editor of a website called Defense One. We're a sister organization of The Atlantic. That's my short speech. I'm a Pentagon reporter. So I cover the military. I cover the hard security and conflict. But I first started out in this town on the soft side of things long ago. And so I was thrilled to be asked to help moderate this discussion at this moment. I'm going to stand. Which in our world of covering defense and security is filled with lots of questions, and hopefully we'll get to some of them today. I think we could do a lot of preaching to the choir in this room, probably. I'm assuming there's a lot of people on the same page about what needs to happen, what should happen in Syria. Hopefully we'll get some good ideas from the panelists and from you in the audience as well as we continue. Maybe I'll kick us off with a short anecdote to bring us to where we are, and then hear from you, Michael, about the European roles that are happening in Syria, and then we'll make our way down the line. I just came recently from Tampa, where there was a change of command for Central Command and Special Operations Command. So the top U.S. general in charge of all troops from the border of Turkey to Pakistan. I was one of the reporters fortunate to go on a tour with him through the region a year ago, including one day in Syria, where we flew up from Baghdad to Raqqa for his first visit to the city about less than 2 months after it had been liberated. And it looked like, we said, Dresden from World War II. He said the only other place he had seen with more destruction was Mosul, not far away. But at the time, there were very, very small signs of life of the city coming back. And I've written about this and noted how we saw some families, some children, mostly on the outskirts of the city, but making their way in. As we drove around in trucks with special forces officers. And I watched a young child grabbing concrete that was attached to metal rebar and banging the concrete off and saving the rebar because they were collecting all the metal that they could. And the special forces captain in our truck said, "I wouldn't pick up anything in this city that I didn't put down myself." And that was a year ago. Cut to last week, I ran into Robin Wright, a reporter for The New Yorker, who just had a piece out this week. She interviewed the top SDF general, who said she also had just gone to Raqqa, and now there were lots of children, similar to the photos we saw on the way in, wearing colored backpacks, brightly colored dress, going to school. But it masks a whole lot of problems in the country. So let's get to those quickly. Michael, we didn't get a chance to meet beforehand, so I don't have much of an intro for you other than to say we're here to talk about a lot of the civilian structures that are needed to go forward, but maybe start us off with a lay of the landscape and with what you do.
Excellent question, and thank you first for moderating this discussion and for hosting the event here. Actually, this exhibition was shown in the headquarters of the External Action Service for the first time. Federica Mogherini inaugurated it. And it's part of our effort to not allow the conflict to be forgotten. And you don't forget the conflict if you see the human faces. And it's exactly the same philosophy that led us to organize the Brussels II, Brussels III conference, the Brussels III conference on 14 March, which was composed, if you so want, of 3 days. The ministerial, the classic conference, where we did all the pledging, that was only the end of it. But before that, we had 2 days of dialogue. And these days of dialogue, where we rented the biggest room we could find in Brussels, which is the main plenary room of the European Parliament, brought together more than 1,000 people from Syria. More than 400 NGOs represented. And we discussed the problems of the young generation, the problems in education, the problems in the labor market, the structure that it takes, questions of accountability, the space for civil society, both inside Syria but also in the hosting countries where the refugees live right now. And this is important because, as Stavros reminded us, we are now in year 8 of the conflict. It is still the biggest humanitarian disaster on earth, rivaled by Yemen, I have to say. But it is a huge conflict, and we don't see the light at the end of the tunnel. Yes, we see some internally displaced persons going back to their home region. We see some refugees coming back from Turkey, from Lebanon, and so forth. But in comparison with the total numbers of people who have left, this is really being dwarfed, so to say. So in other words, we have problems and questions all over the place. What to do with those people who now live for 8 or 9 years in Lebanon, for example, or in Turkey? And that is why we have created financial instruments, because in the beginning, it was just a matter of feeding and providing shelter. Yes, classic humanitarian aid, which is absolutely important. But what do you do after a year, after 2 years, after 3 years? I always put myself in the situation of a father of a Syrian family who flees Syria with 3 kids in 2011. Maybe, 6, 8, 10 years old. 8 years on, I mean, make the counting, so to say. What has happened if they didn't have school education? What happens with the one who had 10 years and is now 18 and now wants to go for vocational training or for university studies and so forth? This is about the perspectives of an entire generation of millions and millions of people. We're speaking about 5.6 million refugees alone, half of which at school age. So this is about creating, so to say, hope for a generation, creating also means of survival, not only for the refugees, but also for the countries that are hosting them. Lebanon, where 1 out of 4 inhabitants now is either a Syrian or a Palestinian refugee. So our first responsibility is to help those people, help them with more than just food and shelter, as important that is. Help them with education, help them with livelihoods, help them with job perspectives. The second problem is to help those countries who help the refugees. Help the hosting communities that are often as poor as the refugees are. If you go to the poorer parts of Jordan, if you go to the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon, for example, these are not people who are at ease, so to say. These are people who are suffering themselves from lack of drinking water, from lack of electricity supplies, from insufficient transport infrastructure, from insufficient trash management systems and so forth. So you have to look at this yourself. And then there's Syria. We see people going back, but only in small numbers. They need to be supported. There is a lack of education. There's a lack of access to drinking water. There's a lack of basic electricity. The political situation, the military situation in the country is shifting more and more. We, and that means the United States just as much as EU member states and the EU institutions, invested big time, for example, in the northwest of Syria, in the Idlib area. Now, after Hayat Tahrir al-Sham has taken over the local councils, we cannot work with local councils any longer. We can still work, fortunately, with civil society. But much of the work that we did with mayors, with city councils, in order to create, local democracy, in order to have local supplies, can no longer be done. So we have to shift again. We have to address our response differently. But we cannot let down the Syrians. We must avoid a situation, as we have seen it in other countries, where the international community moves in with military means, they move out, and then, frankly, the population is left on its own. There are no structures, there's no education, there is nobody to rule the country in any accountable way. And therefore, we are engaging. Last figure, before the conflict, EU development aid for Syria was at a very small level. It was about 35 million euros a year in grant money. Now, what we are investing inside Syria, and I don't even speak about the neighboring countries and the refugees there, but inside Syria is about 220 to 250 million euros a year. So whereas we don't cooperate with the Assad regime, we really try to live up to our responsibility to take care of the Syrian people, knowing that this is insufficient and knowing that the big challenge will only come later, because maybe the war is soon to be over, but the peace has not yet been established, and then we need to shoulder the responsibility together with all the other partners.
Thank you for that. And man, it's so incredibly complicated. And it's a bit refreshing as an American to hear about European financial commitments to a war when in our news cycle, it's nothing but the talk of troops and how many troops are coming out and when are they coming out and if they're going to come out and if the president is going to tweet something different tomorrow about them or not. But there's a lot more going on in the background beside that. So Katja and Mona, I think we'll set you up, Jenny, if we go peace and war in those two. Well, you know, you can fight it out as we go later. Mona, I told her before, and if you haven't gone to the USIP site lately, and unfortunately I hadn't, but they have an excellent interactive timeline of the Syrian conflict, photos and a nice multi-timeline on the bottom, and you click through it. It took about 10 minutes to go through. If you read it all, like if you're a slow placard reader at the museum like I am, it takes a little longer. And really walks you through how complicated the ground war has been. Thank you, Ms. Rasser. The ground war, the players, and the international efforts to stop the fighting and come to a conflict. The UN track, the Astana track. So take us to where we are today with, just the lay of the land of the prospects toward that peace, as you see it alongside of with all the military pullouts that are being advertised.
Thanks so much, Kevin, and thanks to the European Union for including me in this event. It's really important. And I do think we need, though, to keep our eyes focused on the Syrian people, and so I very much appreciate your comments and the contributions of the EU to Syria. I just want to say, I think what's important is, and I think Jenny's going to get into this in greater detail, but I think it's important to note we're not at the end of the conflict. And indeed, I think in many ways we could be entering its most dangerous phase, which will have enormous and very difficult implications for Syrian civilians inside Syria. And in particular, I would highlight a few key flashpoints. One is Idlib in the northwest, which has been since September under a sort of a demilitarized zone agreement. But that's really fraying at the edges, and that could crumble with enormous humanitarian implications. It's estimated that there are 3 million Syrian civilians in Idlib who would be forced to flee, and yet there's nowhere to go because Turkey hosts the largest number in absolute terms of Syrian refugees. I think it's 3.5 million. And Turkey has made clear that it simply cannot open its borders and take on additional Syrians. So there's that. There's the issue of Turkey and the Kurds, which is something that we've all been watching very closely. Another potential flashpoint. Turkey has made very clear its displeasure with the coalition's reliance on Kurdish partners on the ground to fight ISIS. And now as the military campaign against ISIS comes toward its close. We're nowhere near the end of ISIS, and we could talk about that as well. There's real concern that we could see the explosion of a new conflict should Turkey make good on its threats to invade the northeastern part of Syria. And I think finally there's the issue of ISIS resurgence, and I don't want to go too on about it, but I think in many ways the territorial defeat is an important milestone. And it's a bit cliche, but it does not equate to the enduring defeat. And in some ways, the most difficult tasks are the ones that lie ahead. And here I would just maybe highlight the need for stabilization assistance in particular to continue to flow into Syria. The ambassador in his opening remarks talked about, I think he called it sustainable security. Well, in my mind, the first step towards sustainable security is moving forward on issues of stabilization, helping communities get back up on their feet. And last point, I think the most important issue that faces us, the most important challenges that face us today in Syria, I would argue, is really not even that. It's not about getting the lights back on, cleaning out the rubble, IED removal. All of those things are important. It's the invisible factors that have to do with inclusive governance, and most importantly, repairing Syria's very badly frayed, if not ultimately torn, social fabric, building social cohesion, helping traumatized communities address those traumas, helping children get back into school. It's those invisible, sort of less tangible issues that, in my view, are the most important and also the most difficult.
Whose job is that?
I think it's the international community's job.
We'll be more specific.
Pardon?
Be more specific, though.
Well, I think in ISIS-liberated areas, the international coalition that came together to defeat ISIS, but in the process also exerted quite a lot of damage. You yourself saw it firsthand in many of these cities, Raqqa among them. I think it's critical that mission, the mission to defeat ISIS, continue in this next phase with an emphasis on stabilization, on local governance, on helping these communities get back up on their feet. And I also think, of course, the Syrian diaspora, Syrian community has enormous stakes in this. How they can engage, I think we'll be interested to hear from Syrians in the audience. But I do think there's an important role for the Syrian diaspora as well in some of these areas. We have the issue, though, of course, of the Assad regime, which looks like, at least in the short to medium term, it will prevail. And that raises a whole slew of challenges as to what to do in those areas that remain under regime control. That's
a good handoff for Jen, who would talk about that regime, about its future, about some of these refugees returning, and when we talked earlier about a group I don't think we've mentioned yet, Al-Qaeda.
Sure, thank you. And thanks to the EU delegation for having me here today, and to the ambassador, wherever he is, for his incredible and I think very important remarks. It's my view that the Assad regime and its backers have tried very hard to steal Syria's future, to steal it back from the population that so bravely rose up to take it for themselves. I think that they have been extraordinarily successful in creating a military reality that would devastate most populations, and yet this Syrian population is so brave, so resilient, and so clear-minded in the pursuit of its goals and its rights that I think we actually have a lot to learn from them. And I think we ought to be very careful not to take Assad and his backers at their word that they have destroyed this rebellion, because they have not. We're already seeing the signs of early resurgence in ostensibly recaptured areas such as Dera province, where the revolution began, bordering Jordan, that indicate that while Assad's gains may look impressive on a map, they're very fragile. And I think that what the EU is doing, and all of the international community that has invested in humanitarian support within Syria and without Syria, is continuing to support Syria's future. The war in Syria is far from over, and its outcome is far from certain. Assad and the Russians want us to believe that they have won, and they have not. They have not won militarily, and they have not won politically. They haven't won politically internationally, and they also have not won politically on the ground inside of Syria, because forcing a starved and beaten population to surrender is not a political victory. It is not reconciliation, and it does not legitimize the Assad regime. So again, I want to thank the EU, and I want to echo something that Mona has said, which is I do believe that the US and the international community has both an obligation and an opportunity right now in eastern Syria to likewise invest in Syria's future and to help Syrians take it back for themselves. It is not ours to determine. And Syrians will and continue to fight for it every single day, and I very much look forward to the comments from those in the audience as well. I think that we have an opportunity and not just a requirement, and I think we deny sometimes Syrians the agency that they've fought so hard for when we treat them solely as victims that need life-sustaining humanitarian aid. They absolutely are victims, in my view, of a terrible and atrocious regime. They are victims of a set of military circumstances that weaker people might not survive. But their resilience is completely astounding. And I just want to leave it on that note, because I think we can become overtaken by the messages from the Assad regime. We can become overtaken by the brutality and the conditions of destruction inside of Syria and the exhaustion that is natural, given the fact that this war has entered its 9th year and is nowhere near concluding. But I think we need to take a page out of Syria's book, actually, and help them fight for their own future, because this is far from over. Its outcome is far from certain. I didn't talk about al-Qaeda, but I will make one final note, which is that the jihadists, al-Qaeda and ISIS, are also trying to steal Syria's future. And they're expending a lot of resources in order to do it. And they've had some successes. And we've started to fight back. We've created an opportunity in the East that we need to exploit. We need to figure out what to do in Idlib in order to contain al-Qaeda. And we need to fight the Russian-led narrative that what the US and the international community should do is let the Assad regime retake Idlib, or that the problem is getting Turkey on board with an operation into Idlib. That's not the problem. The problem is the Assad regime and its backers and the fundamental conditions of violence that even created the opportunity for al-Qaeda and ISIS to dig their roots into this theater and this population. Until and unless we can face fact on that and remain clear-eyed and true about the definition of what is actually driving the extremism and what is denying Syrians their future, we're frankly wasting time. And we're buying into the Russian narrative in particular that is so damaging here in the United States and causes confusion that we actually don't need to become victim to. So I would leave it there, but happy to engage in Q&A as well.
No, well, thank you. And I think you've all set up plenty of tracks to tackle, and those in the audience, think of your questions. We'll get it going soon. I'll come out there like Phil Donahue and get the mic to you. For those of you that remember Phil Donahue, so this is what I'm hearing. I'm hearing simultaneous. The war is continuing. There's a potential insurgency or a continuation of the rebellion, whatever you want to call it, to come, but from different groups, from jihadists, from al-Qaeda, from ISIS remnants, as well as Free Syria, whatever's left over. There's refugees returning, probably to not a good welcoming wagon, but with massive investment from the Europeans. What I haven't heard much about is the United States. And since we're in the United States, I want to ask a little bit of license to get your thoughts on what you're hearing from this administration, those of you, as much as you can say in your roles, about the way forward for the United States in this conflict. Is there a role for the U.S. to play anymore in the peace forward or in the continuing security situation? And if so, what could it be? What should it be?
I'm a bit embarrassed because I'm just out of 2 meetings in the State Department where we discussed these things. So whatever I would say would probably...
We were going to have a State Department representative who could have spoken for himself, but
what I
he has the
can
flu.
only say is I think I fully agree with my both co-panelists that first, the conflict is not over, and secondly, we tend to forget that the real problem is the Assad regime. We, at some point, thought that maybe using poisonous gas is the real problem. And then later on, we thought that Daesh or ISIS is the real problem. And there are problems, of course. But the underlying problem that there still is that with this government, there will be no inclusive society, or I could turn it differently. They can win the war, maybe they have not, but they cannot win the peace. And those people who made them win whatever they won will not be able to make them win the peace. Now, if there is no peace, then Syria and the entire region remains a huge cradle for instability, with whatever that means, for the people in the region, for the neighboring countries, for Europe, but including also Russia and other countries. And therefore, I think there's only one possibility, that is to engage. And that is also true for the United States. It would be, I think, if you allow me to say so as a European, it would be hugely detrimental for the US security interests, on the interests of its allies, to, in a way, not engage in order to win the peace later on. Now, what we are doing right now is to define the terms for this. And I think there's strong agreement between the US administration and the European Union, including European member states, that as long as there is no credible transition in Damascus, we don't engage in reconstruction. And so we have to define the fine line, what it means to help the basic needs of the population and engage in early recovery, but not reconstruct, which means engaging with the authorities to build up the society. But in the long haul, I cannot imagine anything which would not see, so to say, a massive engagement of the international community and obviously very much also the United States in this area.
A role for the United States?
Absolutely. I mean, I think the U.S., we're at a difficult moment politically in this country with respect to U.S. engagement across the globe. And I think there is growing fatigue in our population about what it is. Why should we care about Syria? Why should we be intervening far away from home? And I would argue, beyond the moral issues that we've all been talking about in different ways, there is absolutely the notion that we've all learned now as the Syrian conflict enters its 9th year, that one cannot insulate what happens in Syria from the region and from the world. And we can show all kinds of reverberations that have happened in the immediate neighborhood of the region to Europe, Brexit, and frankly, in some ways, even to some of the attitudes that we find in our own country with respect to refugees. I think there are continuing issues, not only with displacement, but also with extremism. And so it's vital that the U.S., in my view, remains engaged. And there is an opportunity, and I really like the way Jenny put it, because I think that's true. What happened, what the counter-ISIS coalition managed to achieve, and we were talking a little bit about this, Kevin, before the event, is pretty momentous when you think about it in terms of the amount of land that was liberated, the relatively, from an American perspective, now I'll speak as an American, the low cost in terms of blood and treasure with respect to the U.S. And this very important opportunity, not only to do what's right by the Syrian people in that part of Syria, but this, in my view, also represents important leverage that we should understand as we think about how do you shape the trajectory, how does one shape the peace process going forward. And admittedly, Geneva has been pretty frozen and pretty stalemated. But does this current moment we find ourselves in with the territorial defeat of ISIS and the coalition, together with our partners on the ground, in control of more than 25% of Syrian territory, and very important Syrian territory with respect to the resources that are there, can this be leveraged in some way? And I'm asking the question, it's not easy, to help perhaps shape Syria's future in a way that actually, truly will lead to what the ambassador spoke about it initially, sustainable peace and security in Syria. And I think it's a question that we all need to explore, but it can't happen, to your question, without U.S. leadership, in my view.
Jenny, take us somewhere else.
Sure. Well, I'm not sure what new I can add, because I definitely agree with all the comments as stated.
Well, let me frame it for you then. You spent your remarks talking about Assad specifically.
Yep.
What can the U.S. do about Assad at this point?
Sure. Well, I think the first thing we need to do is retain our resolve, actually, not to give in to this dictator or his backers. And I say that because it's not easy. It's not a given that we can continue to endure the political costs, the resource requirements, and frankly even remain focused on this as a key national security issue with everything else going on in the world. So it takes effort, and it takes civilian leadership. And we often discuss rightly that the defeat of the physical caliphate will not lead to an enduring defeat of ISIS, right? But that's not actually the Defense Department's fault. The Defense Department was given a mission, and it executed that mission very effectively, and it liberated a whole host of people that desperately needed our help. The lack of a strategy is the responsibility of the civilian leaders of this government, who allowed a military-only campaign to proceed with no support to the military effort from other tools of American power, and no support to the Syrian population, including those that fought ISIS and those that suffered under both ISIS and counter-ISIS operations. So we need to do better. We need to learn the lessons of past wars. We know that there is no military solution to anything. Wars are fought for political ends. We know that. We've lived it. We've fought it. We've paid the price in blood. And yet we're repeating past mistakes because we wanted to do one thing in Syria, and that was counter ISIS, and we didn't want to deal with the rest of it. Until we were done with counter ISIS, and then we, the US, were like, well, now what? Now we have to find a political outcome. But everybody else was way ahead of us. And so then we spent months and months playing catch up to the Russians to try to block their alternate Astana process for a negotiated settlement, which led to a success, in my view, reinstating Geneva as the only viable process, which was important, but it is nowhere near sufficient. So we need clear political goals, and we need a clear strategy for what outcomes are we actually trying to accomplish, recognizing that this war is far from over. We're likely not going to get a Geneva settlement that is acceptable because, by the way, Bashar al-Assad has never had any intent to negotiate. He is sending signals to the population, both that residing in Syria and residing elsewhere, that they should expect nothing new from Assad except the torture, the detention, and the punitive measures that he has been conducting his entire life, or his entire time in rule, at least. So the execution notices to the families of detainees is a very vibrant example, in my view, that while he claims to have ended the war, he has no intent to accept a population back until and unless it submits to him politically. It's actually an opportunity for us. He doesn't have as much leverage as he thinks that he has. If we had more clear vision and were more creative with our tools of statecraft beyond the military instrument, we could actually be isolating him a lot more. We could be constraining his ability to prey upon his population, and we could be protecting the desperate Syrians living in refugee camps and suffering under pressure of forced returns, et cetera, from that kind of retribution moving forward. So I think that there's a lot we can do. I think we need to get creative, and I think what we should avoid is looking to the Defense Department as if what we need is a military solution, which nobody here has ever done, but I think is sometimes a natural aspect of the debate since this has been a military-led effort so far. It should have been a military effort, shouldn't have been military-led only. We need to figure out what's next, and I do think that the U.S. can play a significant role leading that way forward.
Mona, that reminds me, I forgot to mention earlier, I wanted to ask you to share with us the work of the Syrian study group that you're a part of, which some people may or may not know in the room, and just kind of let us know why this started and what to expect out of it in your timeline.
So the Syria study group is a study group that was mandated by Congress. USIP is in a facilitating role. So I serve as the executive director by virtue of being at USIP. Let me be very clear, I am not in the Syria study group. Its members were appointed by members of Congress, 6 Democrats, 6 Republicans, so a bipartisan congressional study group. And its mandate is really to develop a comprehensive strategy for Syria. And the group is in the midst of its deliberations, and the end point of its work will be sometime in September. And at that point, that's when a report will be released.
You know, this was spurred, it was Jeanne Shaheen's measure, right? Senator Shaheen, who put it out there. And I think, you know, it's fair to say the reason for having a study group to come up with a strategy or purpose is a commentary on the administration for not having it in the first place and coming up with something that somewhat mirrored or reflected the Iraq study group of the last decade. So we'll look forward to that. I just wanted you to mention that. Audience questions. I know there's a lot to talk about security, but the main panel in the event is supposed to be a little bit more about the civil society side of things, so feel free to shift the conversation any way you like. I would add to what you all have been saying to try to think as well, not just about U.S. leadership, but about our electorates in our various countries as well. We're starting to cover the 2020 presidential campaign in this country, and I'm starting to direct some of our editorial coverage on the foreign policy positions of these candidates. And I tell you what we don't hear a lot of, and that's Syria. Of course, we don't hear a lot about Afghanistan. We don't hear a lot about Iraq. We don't hear a lot about all of the wars. That's not something I think new candidates like to come out of the gate talking about. A couple have. We have some actual veterans out there. But if there's going to be a U.S. role into that conflict or into its solution politically, with negotiations or continued security elements on the ground, it's going to require at least the tacit acknowledgement, if not the support of the American people as well. And I don't think that's a settled question yet either. So I had a question in the far back, patiently up early on, and we'll get some more to come. Oh, you have them, Mac. There
Hi,
you
so
go.
thank you all for being here. My name is Darren Fenwick. I'm with the Syrian American Council. And so my question for you all is, speaking of the civil society bit, I mean, from our perspective, of course, Assad is the disease and everything else is the symptom, and that the international community has really just waited on enough people to die for the conflict to just kind of burn itself out by the deaths of a bunch of people. So thinking about civil society and thinking about the conversation about leverage, what specifically can the EU do you think, all of you, and then what specifically can other governments do to support civil society in terms of the role that they play in creating leverage for the Assad, to maybe somehow force the Assad regime to the table, right? Because that's one thing that the international community seems to fail to do, is put leverage. The G7 statement that came out on Syria was laughable in my perspective, because it said, oh, the regime should protect people in Syria, but they want to kill people. So it doesn't even acknowledge the reality of the regime and what they want to do. Thanks.
Mike, want to start?
Your very sophisticated question requires some reflection time, but if you allow me to answer without reflection time, that gives the two ladies a bit more time. The first thing is the existence of a vibrant civil society in Syria is a value in itself. So keeping the civil society alive, both inside Syria and also in the neighboring countries, through financial support, through moral support, through political support, that for me already is something. I had the privilege of chairing one of these sessions during the Days of Dialogue in Brussels, with, more than 1,000 people there. It was most impressive. Not only the presence of people, including from inside Syria, who somehow made it possible to travel to Brussels, but also the maturity of their analysis, of their comments. They didn't ask for, castles in the sky, for things of imagination. No, they came with proposals. They came with viable approaches. This was great. That gave me hope for the future of Syria. That's one. Secondly, civil society is an essential instrument to address a couple of issues that are vital for the future of Syria. For example, when it comes to demonstrating and recording house and land property rights, who would do that? Certainly not the regime. But it's important in times of law number 10 and others. So we are supporting that. We are financing NGOs that are really looking into the recording of who is the owner of what, so to say. The same thing for accountability. War crimes, documenting war crimes and so forth. That also is a civil society operation, if you so want, which we finance financially. And then, of course, it has been said that in reality, the Assad regime is very fragile. So not all the map that you see in the news show in the evening that shows that this or that territory is under Assad's control is really governed by Assad. In reality, many of the basic services there are supplied by either local councils or by civil society organizations, and there we try to support as much as possible. The danger and the risk that we are taking as operational officials, so to say, is that we need to distinguish who is a good partner. Not every civil society is really civil society. There are lots of gongos around, and there are lots of people who basically are close to the regime, but then disguising themselves as civil society. So it's a very mined territory. But I think that should not discourage us from investing in civil society, which for me is the future of Syria.
And I would just add, I think the European Union has done quite a bit with the civil society support room, which is focused solely on Syrian civil society organizations. Our own State Department and AID have also done work over the last 8+ years through DRL, the Democracy, Labor and Human Rights Bureau, as well as USAID's OTI Bureau. They've done work with civil society organizations in Syria. And honestly, the most powerful voices on the ground are Syrian voices, and those are who really we need to be engaging with. I would say, though, I think it's important as we enter this later phase in the conflict, a couple things. One is, I had the opportunity to review a number of Track 2 and civil society efforts supported by the EU through the Syrian Peace Process Support Initiative. And what was really incredible to learn is how much actually has been done and continues to be done on the ground across Syria, particularly in the area of local peace building, and working at the hyper-local level to help communities begin to start to address these very, very deep differences that I articulated in the beginning that continue to divide Syrian society. And it's actually quite impressive what they're able to do. However, I think there's a point now that we have to think about the risks involved for Syrian partners on the ground. And there are real risks, and I think it's incumbent. Of course, those involved can evaluate the risks, but it's incumbent on outsiders who are supporting this work to be very clear about what those risks and dangers are. One of the things that we've learned in some of the track twos that I observed is that those who go back to regime-controlled areas are facing increased surveillance and scrutiny by the Assad regime as it feels, rightly or wrongly, that it has more control. And so I think we're really at a very delicate moment where it's very important to continue to support these efforts, but to be very, very clear-eyed about the inherent risk, and to be sure that in doing so, we aren't actually further endangering Syrians on the ground. And what is the way to provide support in a way that doesn't actually further endanger people, but actually it allows them, enables them to do more of the very, very good work that they're doing. And one last point I would note, in eastern Syria, there is a lot of very interesting work that's going on, certainly with local councils. There's some real challenges with how representative some of those local councils are. USIP, the organization that I work at, is doing local level dialogues in northeastern Syria, helping to already begin to bridge some of these communal differences as a way of helping to enable returns. Because people will not return to communities if they don't feel safe, if they don't feel that these underlying tensions aren't being addressed.
So I would add just a very brief comment, which is that I'm a military analyst by trade, but what I can say is that the thing that I think concerns Assad the most is not the military threat. It's a political threat. So I think the single most important thing strategically that the EU, the United States, and each of us as individuals can continue to do is to give Syrians a voice, to continue to enable a political discussion, a debate, and a future that is not defined either by Assad or, frankly, by the current contours of the Geneva negotiations. So we need to give Syrians a voice, and that's as important abroad, in my view, as it is locally on the ground with those that are still remaining inside of Syria, because I sure don't know what the future holds, but I think that a future president of Syria may be a child in a refugee camp right now. I like to think it's probably a baby girl, but it's equally as important for us to empower those communities as it is for us to rebuild inside of the country. So there's no shortage of opportunities of how to do this. We just have to find the will.
He's coming around the microphone.
Thank you for the presentation. And my question is related with the Trump's decision that's declaration Iranian Revolutionary Guards as a terrorist group. Do you think this declaration means that United States more involvement in Syria in the near future? And if it does, can Trump reconsider its withdrawal decision from Syria? Thank you.
So I'm happy to start, in part to give other people more time to actually think, since I've been benefiting from the order. I don't currently see signs that the Trump administration is considering more involvement in Syria in terms of countering Iran physically and on the ground. We do still seem to be in the process of revising the revision to the decision to withdraw, which is laughable in that this is how policy is forming, frankly, but is good. It's good that we're walking away from the decision to withdraw immediately. It is good that we are now revisiting some fundamental questions about why are we there, what is necessary, and what are we trying to do. I think we need to be having that debate. Frankly, I think we need to be having it at an even wider aperture. So I'm hopeful that this actually won't resolve soon in the sense that it will continue to be a live discussion. I look forward to the recommendation of the Syria Study Group. I'm sure it will be excellent under your leadership. But I think that what we do know is the Trump administration has recognized that a hasty withdrawal to Syria leads to outcomes we cannot tolerate. It leads to outcomes that are asymmetric in that this isn't just about ISIS anymore. This is about Turkey invading, which means it's now also about the Turks the Turks working with Russia, and we have the first claimed al-Qaeda attack in the Euphrates River Valley now. And so I think we're actually in the bargaining stage of grief here, of working our way through to the recognition that you cannot pick one problem in Syria and solve only that problem. And I think that's what is causing this churn within the debate about what if to say, what to do, et cetera. I don't think any of that has been settled, and I don't think the IRGC designation indicates that we've necessarily made a new decision. But I think we're on the right trajectory, frankly. I think it should be messy because the Syrian conflict is, and our solution needs to grapple with all of that complexity.
So I might just add, I think Jenny's put it out quite well. I mean, for me, one way to look at the designations, and there have been multiple ones now. IRGC is the latest, but there have been a number of designations over the last several months. There's also been movement toward increasing economic pressure through sanctions. In some ways, I think this is sort of considered, potentially, and we can talk about how effective it is, a substitute for U.S. boots on the ground. So in some ways, these decisions, possibly, I don't know, this is my own speculation, I don't have an inside track on this, but that some of these decisions may be, in fact, in direct response to a decision to withdraw or to draw down some number of troops, and thereby sort of embolden or sort of strengthen the position on Syria using other tools, designations, and sanctions among them.
That's the audience, yes, right here.
Thank you. My name is Karen Dickman. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute for Multi-Track Diplomacy. And we have been working in Syria, not in the last year, but in the past we have spent significant time and resources working on the Syria situation. One of the other things we do, though, is we have the tools to deal with mass trauma. Now, one of the primary first lessons that one learns in trauma treatment, whether it be on a personal or on a national scale, is that you don't strip agency. Which means, I mean, if Syria is not a traumatized country, there is no such thing. It's not possible that it is en masse not traumatized. But to strip it of agency by doing prescriptive development doesn't help. And we have the tools to be able to have large-scale, multi-track, deconstructed national dialogues where we can know who are the actors that can be trusted, who are the ones who are shaping decisions in Syria. And it seems like those things are obvious, but from the outside, they absolutely are not obvious. But we do know, we have tools to find out who knows. We have tools to find out what they want for their country, and they have tools to find out how they see getting there. And I think that to honor agency, we need to do that. And otherwise, one of the things that prescriptive development has done with all its good intentions has, throughout the world, just generated lots and lots of corruption. And we don't need to reinvent that. I mean, using the Iraq model, is that really a good idea? It didn't work in Iraq. We have the tools to do so much better. And that fundamentally goes to recognizing and honoring the agency of the Syrian people. They're educated, they're smart, they're competent.
Well, thank you. So what are the thoughts of the checks and balances to some of the concerns that she's raised, and also, say raising the Iraq model? I mean, even the Americans are the first to say that that's not what they've wanted, that's not what they've advocated for. There are no large, giant construction projects. Right. There's no rebuilding going on. It almost, some say, to a huge fault. There's not much of anything American going on the ground. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I thank you for raising those questions. I mean, I think first the issue of trauma is enormous. We did a panel at USIP called Invisible Wounds, and it was looking precisely at the incidence of trauma, particularly among Syrian children, which is enormous. And it featured someone from the Syrian American Medical Society who had recently done a whole study on this. And I think what's important is integrating much more psychosocial support, and that is being done at a local level, whether it's in Syria. Yeah, I think that's very important. Yeah.
But you can't do trauma treatment for millions and millions of people one at a time.
Well, I think there are ways in which children who are suffering from trauma and who one step forward is already helping them to get into schools, but that is not enough. They are inhibited from learning because of the extent of trauma that they have suffered. And there are absolutely psychosocial interventions that have been and should continue to be integrated into that programming that absolutely does help. And that's being done inside Syria to the extent possible, and it's also being done with Syrian refugee children, and it's of critical importance. The other point I would raise is the importance of track 3 dialogues, and that too is going on, and that's of critical importance. I think what we're learning in Syria is that this is a hyper-local conflict, and I don't think it's in anyone's intention to remove agency from the Syrian people, not by a long shot. Track 3 is a way of actually transferring, and it's being done, views from the ground up to even more formal track 1 negotiations. But let me make one last comment, which is let us not in any way, shape, or form understate the complexity and the difficulty of working in Syria. To do otherwise, I think, would be pure folly. And I do think there have been very important lessons learned from Iraq, from the many, many mistakes that were done in Iraq. And part of that is what you're seeing in terms of stabilization assistance that the US and others are deploying in Syria. It's not bags of cash. It's not trillions of dollars. It's much smaller amounts. It's nimble. It's being done by Syrian partners on the ground, so it's organic. And there is clear buy-in, and that is essential. And I think Syria, with all of its difficulties and all of the problems, I think there's going to be some very important, actually positive lessons learned that come out of that experience.
We're down to our last a few minutes. I wanted to give you a chance to finalize your thoughts on, let's bring it back to the beginning, kind of the short term and the medium term steps forward to how this conflict ends, in your view, of what's needed for it. I know it's a big question, but I think, Jenny, you may have said it best, that there is a bit of a stalemate. That's like the 12th stanza, round. I don't know how many UN rounds there have been or how many more there will be to come. I see a lot more pictures of Putin and Erdogan and other leaders that are not the American president. Occasionally, they're the European leaders, Macron and Merkel recently getting more involved. What are the steps forward to change the calculus of the violence on the ground, to keep the jihadists from coming back, or to utilize them, leverage them somehow, and how all the non-military ways that this war is going to end, that are going to help either create that political peace that has to happen or some other future that's going to be different than what we're looking at now?
Sure, so I'll start. I still think the most important thing we need to do is to invest in the Syrian population and therefore Syria's future. I think we need to avoid rushing this and avoid looking for an easy way out or a near-term solution, and recognize that this has been 8 years of a devastating conflict, that the country is destroyed because Assad destroyed it, and then our counter-ISIS campaign destroyed other parts of it. It's probably going to continue for another decade because even Assad's gains, as I mentioned earlier, are not going to endure. The rebellion has returned to Deraa insofar as there are now peaceful protests again against Assad in Deraa city. It only took like 6 months, but there are also insurgent attacks. Al-Qaeda is very alive and well. They will continue to conduct military operations, and they will expand beyond Idlib. I just mentioned an attack in southeastern Syria in the Euphrates River Valley. That is just a sign of what's to come. So we need to be clear-eyed about that, and we need to plan on the assumption that this will take generations. That's not an easy thing for us to admit, because we don't like planning in terms of long-term, because there's a natural political tendency to want near-term outcomes and to be able to sell to the American people near-term outcomes. And it's difficult to plan for longer, and it takes leadership, and it takes commitment. And that's hard, but we owe it. We owe it to this brave population, and frankly, we owe it to the rest of the world, because the consequences of allowing the Syrian conflict to just continue on its trajectory without doing what we can to set conditions over time for a better future, those consequences affect everybody. They're not contained to Syria because the jihad isn't contained to Syria. We, of course, have the refugee burden and the social consequences of that climate inside of Europe. We have all of these reasons to invest in this population. We're the only thing standing in our way. And I think it's actually a simple thing to say. It's obviously a very difficult thing to do, but we have to start there with the clarity of our goals and then build a plan forward that does block the Astana process and the Russians and the Turks, but recognizes that they're not going to deliver an outcome inside of Syria. The Russians tried to hold a big summit in Sochi, and they couldn't even get the opposition to attend with Turkish support because it was a sham. So we need to worry a little less that somebody else is going to define the terms of the end of this conflict, because they're not. That's not even what the Russians are really after, in my view. They want some kind of superficial rubber stamp of Assad that the international community supports. Well, that's only effective if people support it. They can try a rubber stamp and we can refuse to accept it. So I think we need to recognize where the actual power in Syria comes from. It's the population, and we actually have more leverage than we think we do. And I'm not as scared as the Russians as they would like me to be.
Michael.
Yeah, although I would love to have Jenny's plan as a plan B, not as a plan A, because it would be nice to come to a better solution a little bit earlier and not to show that amount of strategic patience that maybe we need to be able to offer. But I mean, what is the basic fact? The basic fact is that the regime is, I wouldn't say perfectly happy, but rather happy with the present situation. So they are not a mover. Okay, they would like to have Idlib as well. But I mean, they're perfectly happy with millions of Syrians staying abroad. They're happy with social engineering in the country. They're happy, they're basically happy right now. That's it. So they don't have any kind of stimulation, motivation, or whatever, to change anything. So the question is, what can make them change? And I think there are two things. First, one is that the supporters of the regime, I'm speaking here about foreign powers, need to feel that it becomes more and more costly for them to continue the kind of support that they do. And the US policy towards Iran is one element in this context, but there may be other elements as well concerning Russia and others. And secondly, and I come to the same conclusion, it's the population. The most serious threat to the current status quo are the demonstrations in Damascus, are the demonstrations of those who have held out so far, but now don't want to pay the price of a war economy any longer. So at some point, somebody in the presidential palace there has to come to the conclusion that it becomes a destabilizing factor not to be able to invest more in the people and invest in the future of the young generation. And then the next step is to find out, I will not get this support neither from the Iranians, nor from the Russians, nor from the Chinese. I will get it from somebody else. And then one has to be very clear in the conditions, so to say, that we impose in order to make such help available. This may take a long time, but I believe that as soon as the regime understands that this becomes a destabilizing factor for its very survival, it might be able to switch. Because in the history of the Assad family, and I'm referring more than to Assad pair, Hafez at the time, they have shown the ability of changing, so to say, the social basis of the supportership in order to survive. It's not easy, but I'm sure the pressure will come from the population, and that may make things move at a moment that we don't even foresee. That is the lesson that I take from the Arab Spring. It happened. We didn't forecast it. We didn't plan for it. We didn't know where it would start. We didn't know which kind of development it would take. And the same thing happens right now in Algeria, for example. Maybe we are going to say something new in Syria which nobody of us has on the radar screen.
Something new in Syria, Mona?
No, but I'll offer two very quick things. One is I think we need to exert an impact where we can. And here I think Eastern Syria is critical. Jenny's noting you're already seeing the early indications of a resurgence of ISIS and other jihadists into the area. Stabilization. This is critical in order not to allow dangerous power vacuums to arise that can be exploited by extremists and others. Secondly, I don't think we've talked enough about the refugees. The fact of the matter is the average refugee stay in a host country is anywhere between 17 and 25 years. It's a generation plus. And I think, particularly as Americans, when I believe my understanding is that the United States admitted 9 Syrian refugees last year, it's critical to understand the burden, the international public good that countries like Jordan and Lebanon and Turkey are providing in hosting all of these refugees. But their patience is not endless, and I think here assistance, very much like the EU really is in many ways a model in terms of its resilience work, is critical to these countries because their stability is also quite fragile, and I think that's an area that we need to focus on.
Well, I think you all have a lot of allies in this room, and I'll close it once again referring to, as a military reporter, what we cover in here, and again, being at the change of command at Central Command and SOCOM just a couple weeks ago, hearing the same things from those mouths, from 4-star generals, from like General Votel, who just retired, but who pounded his fist on the table asking for international assistance to come do the stability ops because he felt they did their job. They did the buy-with-through, they set up the SDF, they defeated ISIS like they were asked to do on the ground, but then they stood up at the retirement ceremonies and said the war is not over yet. And the new acting Secretary of Defense said the war is not over yet. And the Chief of the Army, General Milley, who's going to be the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs in September, said the war is not over yet, despite that the President has already said that the war is over. So there's a lot more to come. Today in Raqqa, 2 bombs went off. First, one bomb was set off first. SDF fighters came to the aid, and a second bomb went off, killing 4. 8 people were killed in total. Elsewhere in the country, an IED struck a U.S. coalition convoy, hitting a U.S. truck with personnel in it. No one was injured. Part of the truck was blown out. That also happened today. And also today, the new Special Ops Commander, General Clark, was in the House testifying and said just this morning, Chief Warrant Officer, I'm going to forget his name. The Chief Warrant, Jonathan, who was killed in January in Manbij, was just laid to rest in Arlington National Cemetery. So this war is definitely still going on, and there's a lot happening. Thank you for your time and for your insights. We will continue to watch what you produce and for the work you do. And thank you for attending and watching us. I'll hand it back over to Martin.
Yeah, join me in thanking all the speakers tonight. Kevin, Michael, Jen, and Mona, thank you very much. This conversation will obviously continue, including now tonight at the reception. I hope you'll have time to enjoy the exhibition and speak to our panelists here. Thank you for joining.